it's a travesty because we are burning through these passionate people to the point where most of them actually end up leaving activism altogether because they cannot sustain it. And so I think this question of what is sustainable, what is healthy, how do we engage in a way where we are not completely sacrificing all of ourselves, and such that it will allow us to remain part of this effort for decades on end, hopefully. I think that is a huge question.
Welcome to everybody. We thank Boswell Bookshop for hosting this interview. Again, I am Sally Halderson, Managing Director of Porchlight Book Company, also here in Milwaukee, where we specialize in shipping bulk and customized orders for author and organizational events around the globe. We have the honor today, as Chris mentioned, of welcoming Dorcas Cheng-Tozun. Hello.
Hello. So glad to be here.
Dorcas is a writer and leader whose work with various nonprofits, social enterprises, and faith-based organizations have given her the opportunity to engage with a broad range of social issues towards solutions in the areas of homelessness, affordable housing, energy access, youth leadership, HIV/AIDS, and international development. She is a former Inc.com columnist, and her work has also appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Christianity Today, and dozens of other publications in the US and Asia. And her new book, Social Justice for the Sensitive Soul, How to Change the World in Quiet Ways, is officially out June 20th from Broadleaf Books, but you can get a copy of a book right now from Boswell or ordering it from your favorite local bookstore. We are so pleased to have you join us.
I'm so glad to be here.
So for everybody who has just joined in on our conversation, I welcome you. And typically I do an introduction to the book just to prep everyone here and when others watch the recording in the future. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to take us on a little bit of a journey as a lead-in. My son graduated from high school this past weekend. And as I listened to the speeches during the ceremony, the go out there and be all you can be and live the kind of life you want kind of speeches, I kept thinking about this book. And I found myself thinking back to your origin story, as it were, that you present early on. You tell us that in college, quote, I wanted to dedicate my career to righting every wrong I encountered during my limited time on earth. Like no pressure, right?
Right.
No small goal.
Small goals.
Yeah. And quote, I developed a clear picture in my mind of who I had to be in order to be an effective change agent. And then also, quote, who was, quote, the kind of person who'd happily sacrifice anything for a good cause. So all of these kids in my son's class, for most of them, they have a vision of what they want their lives to be like, what kind of impact they want to have on the world. The speechers centered on the future. They were ambitious about making art, making a difference, building on the successes they had achieved while within the confines of high school. But for most people, what they dreamed was possible when they were young becomes impossible for a variety of reasons. And not necessarily bad ones, and not necessarily in bad ways. When we say the word impossible, it can sound like a negative. But ultimately, what I mean is that our childhood dreams fuel those first exploratory steps into the bigger world. But then as we learn more about ourselves, we might follow a different path than the one we expected to take. Who we are becomes clearer to us, and thus how we can make our dreams a reality changes. Or maybe even what those dreams are change. Learning this can be really destabilizing, and a book like this, your book, and a story like yours helps us accept that sometimes the route that leads us to the future may be very different from the route we thought we would take because we are different people than we thought we were. Mm-hmm. And for me, this is what your book offers, a pathway to making our dreams come true, even if we need to pause at some point in our lives, reorient ourselves, rethink what we thought our dreams were, because it's still there, ready for us to find it. So thank you. Thank you for this book that's going to help so many people persist in finding their way to doing good.
Yeah, of course. I love that reflection. I think that is so true of, the dreams that we have when we're young and our expectations of how life will turn out for us and the impact that we can make on the world. And then when we actually try to do it, the reality of who we are, what our strengths and gifts really are, as well as what our limitations actually are, force us to be in this state of constantly reassessing, who am I and what am I meant to do on this earth, and what is truly meaningful for me.
And it doesn't necessarily mean that because that particular vision may not be the one that you're actually able to put into practice, but it doesn't make it any less satisfying or worthy. And that's, I guess, the journey we'll be on this conversation, during this conversation, and when people read the book. And so I'd like to give people a little taste, if you have a little section that you would be willing to read.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. So this is from the beginning of chapter 3. The chapter is called Shedding the Activist Ideal. And so that's something that I address in the book, is there is this sense, I think so many of us who care about social justice, who want to do good in the world, we have this ideal in our mind of what an activist should be like, who an activist should be, how we should conduct ourselves. And at least for people like me and a lot of other sensitive, introverted, empathic folks, that vision of the ideal just really doesn't work for us. So This is from chapter 3. I wish I could be out there marching with you. Nichelle Nichols, known for her groundbreaking role as communications officer Nyota Uhura on the original Star Trek, spoke those words in 1967 to Martin Luther King when she met him at an NAACP fundraiser after the show's first season. Her lament likely echoed that of many African Americans who couldn't join the civil rights marches happening in the South, perhaps due to work or financial constraints, the inability to travel, health issues, or the real threat of physical harm. Maybe you have thought the same thing or even spoken it aloud. I know I have. I've seen protests and sit-ins and press conferences and advocacy campaigns on the news or social media, and I have wanted desperately to be there. But at the same time, as a sensitive person, I also haven't wanted to be there. The thought of participating in such loud, aggressive, contentious, risky social action terrifies me. I don't feel like I have it in me to do that and still manage my day-to-day responsibilities of working and taking care of my kids. In all likelihood, the resulting stress and trauma would probably outweigh any good resulting from my individual participation. Yet the thought persists. I should be there. I should at least want to be there. At that NAACP dinner, I imagine Nichelle Nichols expected Dr. King to say she should join them on the streets when she could, or she could use her growing fame to speak out more for civil rights. Those are the kinds of responses I've heard from friends and colleagues in social justice when I've sheepishly declined their invitations to go out there. Instead, according to an account Nichols shared with NPR in 2011, Dr. King responded, No, you don't understand. We don't need you to march. You are marching. You are reflecting what we are fighting for. For the first time, we are being seen the world over as we should be seen. Dr. King went on to say that Star Trek was the only show he and his wife allowed their children to stay up late watching. And they watched because of Nichols, one of the only Black women on television, portraying a strong and brilliant leader, highly respected by all her colleagues, whether they were white men or aliens from a distant planet. Nichelle Nichols' work as an actress, which at first glance might seem inconsequential compared to the efforts of those marching, sitting at lunch counters and registering voters, actually contributed meaningfully to the civil rights movement and social progress on a national scale. She did not need to march in the streets. She was, as Dr. King said, already marching in her own way by showing an entire nation what was true and what was possible.
Thank you so much.
Of course.
I love that story. And I think that reflects what we have already dug into a bit, where how we think we should be and how we think we should live, because of what we've seen or what we believe is a narrow definition of that the person who achieves, the person who makes something happen, that it can be, you need a moment where you realize that who you are and what you are is enough, which I think is a big takeaway from your book. So I'm hoping that you can fill in that backstory a little bit that you hinted to there. From the first iteration of your dream to change the world to where you find yourself today as an author of a book that will change the world, because maybe in quieter ways, the way that words do their work, but that will inspire other people to really believe they can still contribute to the causes and to the change that they believe in. What's the arc of your story, and how did it then become this book?
Yeah, so when I was in college, I just developed this real passion for social justice. And of course, the people that you hear about are Martin Luther King and Gandhi and Mother Teresa and Nelson Mandela. And we all have these same social justice heroes that we look up to, and they are remarkable people. But at the same time, I think it is very easy to project ourselves onto them and expect that we can be just like them. And what I have learned through the process of researching this book is that for every Martin Luther King, there are thousands and thousands of people behind the scenes doing so many other roles that are not as recognized, that don't necessarily make it into our history books, but are just as critical. And I feel like their work builds the infrastructure and the scaffolding that somebody like a Martin Luther King can stand upon and share his message to the world. So for me, I graduated from college. That's what I wanted to be. I immediately went into the nonprofit sector and was doing great work, loved the community I was in, loved the colleagues that I was working with. And at the same time, got into this very unhealthy cycle of burning out over and over and over again. So I was pretty much on a 2-year regular cycle. I could never stay in a job for longer than 2 years. After those 2 years, I just would feel exhausted and done. This is when I'm in my 20s, which is when you're supposed to be at kind of your energy level. Yeah. And I just was so tired. And I was working really long hours, carrying a lot of stress, right? It's incredibly emotionally taxing work. And anyone who's been in the nonprofit sector knows that everybody is overworked and underpaid, and that there is just too much to do and you're never done. And I was experiencing heart palpitations. I was having trouble sleeping. And I just thought this was normal because that was all I knew. And then it got to the point where on my, third job at the age of 26, I had a really terrible burnout and slid into a very deep depression, couldn't work for almost 6 months. Went through a lot of therapy, realized I was burned out, but then sort of picked myself up again and was like, okay, I'm over that now.
We talked about it. I'm fine.
Yeah, I got it out. Yeah, I'm good. And then I took another job, this time in the public sector. I was working for county government, which did offer better work-life balance, but there were still some of the same pressures that I carried with me. And then in 2008, I moved to China with my husband. He had started a social enterprise that was providing solar-powered products for families without access to electricity in developing countries. And China was where our manufacturing and product design and engineering were happening. And so we moved overseas to help build up that office and those operations. And there, I think it was, the stress of working for a startup, which I hadn't done before, a startup with a lot of purpose and meaning. So everybody who was there threw all of themselves into the mission of what we were doing. And then the stress of living in what was a foreign country. So I'm Chinese American, but China was very much a foreign country to me. And all of those things together, I think, created this perfect storm of stress and trauma And so then I again burned out, and this was the worst one yet. And so I was in bed, maybe for almost a year. It was hard for me to even leave the flat that we lived in because just the outside world, right? Like stepping outside of our apartment, I was immediately in a foreign country, and it felt very unsafe and very challenging and very stressful. And that was when I realized this is not working. I cannot keep doing what I am doing, or I am going to work myself into a very early grave. Right. But at the same time, it was all I had known professionally. And so I took a lot of time off. And I think I should also mention that my husband, meanwhile, was doing fine. So, we had moved together. He was actually leading the office, so he had a lot more responsibilities than me. We were both working very hard, but there was more, weight of responsibility on him. And China was just as different of a place for him as it was for me. But he seemed like he was doing fine, and he was actually thriving, and I could not understand. And so there was this sense of, what is wrong with me? What did I do wrong? What is it within me that just can't make this work, even though this is work that I'm so passionate about? And yet in so many ways, mentally, physically, spiritually, I felt like it was like a kind of death. There was something that was just the life was just being drained out of me. And so I took a long time to reflect on that. And really all I could do was sleep, eat, cry, and journal. And so out of that journaling, I started writing more and more, and in realizing how healing that was for me, how helpful it was for me to process, but also how meaningful it was to connect with other people by telling my story. Then that grew into the writing career that I've been on for the last decade or so. But I love this book in that it kind of brings me back to where I began. And it's an incorporation of my multiple loves of writing, of creativity, but also social justice, which I have still stayed connected to that world, but I have had to very much remake how it is that I engage.
Yeah. There are so many directions we can go in with everything that you said. And I just want to touch on one very practical thing first. And one of the things that I really love about this book that I think readers are really going to respond to is the fact that you do offer both prompts and instruction. I'm not sure that's the right word, but to help people journal for themselves, to reflect for themselves. It's a very, it's not a workbook, but it definitely does have some components that it's not, singularly a memoir. It's not singularly a advice kind of book, but it actually really does give the opportunity to the readers a way to work through being in that space that you've been in. And how did you know you were doing that when you were writing it, that you were sort of reflecting your own journey through this, from where you were when you couldn't leave the flat to writing this book and using writing to find that place?
Oh, yes. I mean, this book is a very personal book for me. So it actually came from the summer of 2020. Actually, I had been approached by Broadleaf and they had asked me, if you were to write another book, what would it be about? And at that point, I said, I have no idea. And so I went on a walk, which was, the summer of 2020. Going on a walk is pretty much the only thing that any of us could do. So I went on a walk. And as we all remember, there was a lot happening that summer, right? So the pandemic was hitting us, and there were all of these really awful social inequities that were being exposed as a result of the pandemic in terms of income and public health and access to technology and transportation and all of those things. And then there was, in conjunction with the pandemic, a very serious spike in anti-Asian racism and hatred and violence. So I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, which is a place that has a lot of Asian Americans. And so a lot of those incidents of violence that you read about in the news against, especially the elderly who were just attacked, walking down the street, that happened where I live. And so it was a really frightening time to be Asian American. And then also, of course, we had the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, right? And many, many more. And so the Black Lives Matter movement was really building momentum at that point. And it just felt like the world was on fire and everything was falling apart. And all of this was weighing so heavily on me. And I had this sense of, I want to do something. I want to do something so badly. And I went to a couple of Black Lives Matters protests. I was posting on social media because that's what everyone else was doing too. Right. But it always felt like, but I'm still not doing something that is true to who I am. Like I'm imitating what I see everybody else doing. And those things can be effective. But it just felt, there was something in, I think that when you really pay attention to your inner voice, you have a sense of like, I'm doing this, but it doesn't quite resonate with me. And so I was taking that walk and then just the title of the book just kind of popped into my head out of nowhere. And I realized that social justice for the sensitive soul, ultimately, that is what I have been trying to figure out for the last 20 years of my life. Right. And I have not, so I've gotten to the place of, okay, I get the sensitive part. I had, my sister actually had introduced me to the concept of a highly sensitive person a number of years ago. So I did a lot of reading about that and was like, okay, so that's me. But in terms of integrating that with social justice and this real sense of calling that I hadn't quite figured that out. And that had been something I had been struggling with for a very long time. And so this book is, it started as me trying to untangle one of the most fundamental questions that I have personally struggled with, and hoping along the way that it speaks to others who have had similar struggles. Yeah,
that I think that's a wonderful sort of origin story for the book too, right? Because it was at, when that title popped into your head and you were taking that walk, it was at a time where the input for anyone who feels passionate about social justice issues, anyone who feels passionate about helping other people, that ultimately, or breaking down systems, or whatever scope of the change that you want to make is, it felt like we both were incapable of doing anything because we were confined to our houses or confined to a walk. But at the same time, there was such a need. And I think that's an interesting metaphor for also when you are someone who is sensitive, you can sometimes feel held back by your own inability to meet, as you say, the thing you're trying to mimic, or the fill the role that you think you're supposed to fill in order to create change. Yeah. And that really reflects well what the content of the book is. Let's talk a little bit. You mentioned that you had read quite a bit about the concept of the highly sensitive person. And in this book, you utilize the study of introverts, sensitives, and empaths, citing Dr. Elaine Aron, also Susan Cain. And you apply that to the work of pursuing social justice, work that often attracts those exact people who want to, as you said, throw all of themselves into a cause, but ultimately that's a mismatch with these personality traits or types. Can you tell us a little bit more about those personality types within social justice workspace, and kind of what's at risk when we try to model behavior that is not a match for what our sort of skill set is?
Yeah, so the book really is for anybody who identifies as sensitive, and to kind of help draw some more parameters around that. I specifically name highly sensitive people, empathic people, and introverted people. And there's a lot of overlap between the three, but you do not have to be all three. There are plenty of people who are just one and not the other two. But highly sensitive people is a personality trait named by Dr. Elaine Aron about 30 to 40 years ago now. And it is up to 20% of the population. And the people who are highly sensitive, I think they just experience the world at kind of a more intense level. So the sensory input that they receive, the amount of internal processing, the depth of emotion that they feel, it's all heightened compared to, your typical not so sensitive person. Not that, I think everybody is on a range of how sensitive we are, but there is a distinct difference between those who are highly sensitive and those who are not. And so in that regard, highly sensitive people have these very intense inner lives going on. Because we are constantly ruminating, we're constantly processing. If something happens to us, we'll just feel it, and I think you can see how there is this natural overlap with empathic folks as well, right? Because empathy is all about you are so connected to the experience of another. And most often we talk about another person, but there are empaths who connect very deeply with animals, with plants, with the environment, with the sense of like the whole of the earth. But it's, you connect so much with another that you pretty much feel, you take on their emotion, their energy, even their pain. There are some empaths that will feel the physical pain of somebody else, even if, they themselves have not gone through what it is that caused the pain. And then of course, introverts, introverts who just prefer, they draw their energy from being alone, from quiet. It doesn't mean that they don't like being around people, but they just need to recharge in quiet spaces. So there is this really interesting push and pull that happens with sensitive people because as you can imagine, I mean, we are heart-centered people, right? And so as a result, we're so aware of the suffering of others when others are not doing well, when others are marginalized, when there is pain around us, we notice it. It causes us pain, like we feel that pain viscerally. And as a result, then sensitive people tend to be very conscientious and have this strong desire to do something about it, to make things better and to try to end the suffering that they are seeing. And so there is this very strong pull toward, I want to do this kind of work. This is where I find meaning. This is where I find purpose. And it doesn't have to be, your full-time job. This could be something that you do as a volunteer. It could be part-time work. Whatever shape or form it comes in, there is just this desire of, I want to be involved. I want to do something. At the same time, sensitive folks don't tend to like conflict or aggression. Or a lot of noise, right? Yep. It just being at a protest with hundreds of people, thousands of people, that can feel very overstimulating. So I find, if on the rare occasions that I do go to a protest, I come home and all I want to do is go to bed and just like lie in my bed and just be quiet for hours on end, which is not possible because I have young children, but that is what I would do if I could, because it takes so much out of you to just be processing all of that stimulation, all of those noises and things that are happening around you. And yet the work of social justice does feel like it inherently involves conflict and confrontation, and to some degree, some measure of hostility. I don't think it has to, but I think the way it is most often pursued, that is what it looks like. And so, so we can get pulled into these environments and these contexts where, gosh, the work is just so incredibly meaningful. And yet at the same time, it's just draining us day after day after day, right? And as you hear about the suffering of others and the injustices that are going on and this legislation that just needs to get passed and it's not, and like those are the things that just keep weighing you down and down and down. And so we have an incredible, I think, among all activists, not just sensitive activists, there's an incredibly high rate of burnout. There's an incredibly high rate of turnover. And it's a travesty because we are burning through these passionate people to the point where most of them actually end up leaving activism altogether because they cannot sustain it. And so I think this question of what is sustainable, what is healthy, how do we engage in a way where we are not completely sacrificing all of ourselves, and such that it will allow us to remain part of this effort for decades on end, hopefully. I think that is a huge question within the world of activism for all of us to wrestle with, because we are losing really good people. We're losing a lot of talent, a lot of knowledge and wisdom that has been built up. And so then you don't have activists around who can help bring up the next generation of activists, right? It's like every 5-10 years, we're kind of refiguring it out. And that is a really hard way for progress to happen. And so I think sensitive people, because it is so at the forefront of our experience, I actually feel like can be leaders in this area of considering what does it look like to not only care for those around us in terms of the communities that we're serving, but also care for our peers and care for ourselves. Because I actually feel like, and this is, shown in research that there's a Stanford professor who researches self-compassion, right? And it's been shown that the more self-compassion you express and practice in your daily life, the more compassion and empathy and energy you have to give to others. So it really has this multiplicative effect. I think there is this false narrative of self-care and self-compassion being selfish, and that energy should just all go outward, and we shouldn't pay attention to ourselves. But paying attention to our own needs makes us so much better at being able to pay attention to and meet the needs of others.
So there's a risk to the person, there's a risk to the movement, or
Absolutely.
There's a risk to progress. There's so much that is harmed by this using up the energy, either too hard, too fast, all of that kind of stuff that I think that is so common. When I opened this conversation, it was about, young people feeling excited about the future and having this vision for what they think that future is going to look like. And these being balls of energy for making, really believing that what they dream they can achieve. And and your book is not saying anything different to that. It's not saying that we can't do this, we can't achieve this. It's just that we have to do it in a way that is sustainable, because there is so much potential for burnout. And particularly with people who are the people who are most drawn to this kind of work. So it's, as I think you wrote, that it's a double-edged sword.
Yes.
Let's pause for a moment. I think this is always important when I have a tendency to gravitate to books like this, because I do read myself in these books very often. But I think for a lot of people, especially for people who feel passionate or feel like they can bring change, who can really invest themselves, that it's difficult to embrace the word sensitive. And that we have to reclaim the word sensitive. I think we still, even if Elaine Aron, it's been 20, 30 years, 30, 40 years, something like that, when she first introduced highly sensitive people. And I was lucky enough to interview Andre Solo, who was a co-author of a new book called Sensitive.
Yeah.
And, he described being sensitive as, everybody has a bucket, like a sensory bucket, and people who are sensitive, their bucket just gets filled faster and more fully than someone who isn't. So it's not those people don't care. These people care too much. It's a weakness. It just happens to be the way our processing happens, right? So if we were to reclaim the word sensitive and think of sensitive as being powerful, how else would you encourage people who identify as being sensitive or introverted? How would you encourage them to think differently about some of the assumptions that we as a culture make about sensitive people?
Yeah. Elaine Aron uses this great analogy to compare people who are highly sensitive and those who are not. The non-highly sensitive people tend to operate a little bit more like, if you kind of think back a few centuries to how cultures and societies looked, they tend to operate a little bit more like the warrior leader types, know. So they are the quick decision makers. They're all about action, and they tend to be a little bit more aggressive, and they think a little bit more short term. And it's about, gaining resources and moving ahead. But if you had a society that had only those kinds of people, you can imagine where you would eventually run into trouble. Yes. So the highly sensitive people serve as like the counselors and advisors. They are the keeper of the conscience of the society. And they tend to take their time to consider, to contemplate, to remember, and they provide a very necessary balance, right? So when the warrior types are like, let's just go do it, the contemplative advisor types will say, hey, let's stop a moment. Right. Let's think about this. Yeah. Let's come up with a plan. Let's strategize. Let's see what makes the most sense. But also not only that, right? I think they have a tendency to be a little bit more people focused as well. So it's like, who do we need to be part of this? Who is being left out that we haven't yet spoken to? Who do we need to consider? Whose needs are going to be affected by this decision? And so there is so much wisdom and care that sensitive people bring to the conversation. And I think we desperately need that in every space, but certainly in activist spaces. I feel like there is this sense of activism has kind of this red hot feel to it right now. There's a lot of anger, there's a lot of emotion, there's a lot of, let's do it now. And let's just, even if we have to burn the whole thing down, let's do it. And it's very justifiable. I understand the anger. There is so much to be angry about. And at the same time, I think this really harkens back to one of the core teachings of Martin Luther King that we actually don't talk about enough. So we think about his work with civil rights and with nonviolence, but one at the core of what Martin Luther King was trying to do, where he was wanting to get us, was this beloved community. And the beloved community is a place where everybody, even people you completely disagree with, even people who are on the opposite end of the spectrum or the other side of an issue in another political party, they are still seen as beloved and as human and as worthy of love and care and respect as anybody else. And so I think, Dr. King's approach and that of others as well is that if you get the legislation passed that you want, or you topple the leader that you don't like, or you raise awareness to a significant degree about an issue that's important to you, but along the way, you have alienated a lot of people, you have hurt a lot of people, You have pushed away people. You have kind of confined your movement to a very narrow subset of individuals who must perfectly agree with you on all of these things and all of these strategies. Then you haven't actually done what you set out to do, because there has been so much collateral damage that to some extent it can outweigh that particular, victory that you might consider that you've had. Mm-hmm. But we won't really get there until we can learn to, I feel like it's the most basic thing, and yet it has become so hard for us, is this sense of, can you look somebody in the eye who is very different from you, and just see them as human first, right? Before their party affiliation, before their political beliefs, before where they live or what they look like, or but they're just human first, and that's where we begin. And I think that because of their natural empathy and the ways in which they are drawn to people, and to caring for people, that sensitive people, I mean, they can do this almost, intuitively. And It is an incredible gift to the world and to our communities.
Yeah. That separates this feeling of that we aren't good warriors, or we aren't advocating in the way we should be if people's beliefs aren't perfectly aligned with what ours are, and we aren't holding them, if we're looking at someone as a person and not saying that the difference in their belief system or their ideology, that they're going to be cut out of the group, out of the community, like that feels like this really difficult thing in the work we're trying to do to create change, where it's about judgment and it's not about understanding, I suppose, which could get us on a very, very long conversation. Maybe we'll swing back to it, but I do want to continue on what you were saying about how people who are sensitive or introverted or empathic can work to create change. Because I think that's why people come to this book, is trying to find that pathway for themselves. And so you talk about niches, and you talk about finding your fit, right? Mm-hmm. And you present us with 6 options. I'm sure there are many. But we have connectors, creatives, record keepers, builders, equippers, and researchers. Can we dissect a couple of them, or pick one that you'd like to sort of illustrate for us and show how effective being in a role like this could be?
Yeah, so I provide these 6 categories as just examples. They're sort of meant to spark the imagination, because I think that's actually something that we could all really benefit from, is a little bit more imagination when it comes to social change and social justice. How can I do really meaningful social justice work that doesn't necessarily look like what we typically see? And there are people who have done it. And so in every one of those chapters, I draw upon historical figures who have engaged in this type of work in a really meaningful way and have had significant impact. So one of the chapters you mentioned is builders. Okay. So builders, I think of as engineers, inventors, product designers, all those kinds of people who like to tinker and come up with really creative things, new technologies, right? So what is really exciting, and this is a relatively new area. So I feel like we're living kind of in the perfect moment for this of there's this big movement now around design thinking, and how this question of how do we take the best product design principles and apply them to meeting the needs of the poorest families and communities in the world, right? So typically, the very, very best product designers will work for Apple or Meta or Google, or, and they will produce the lovely technologies that we all enjoy. But at the same time, you can make an argument for whether or not we need a new version of the iPhone or,
Right.
a new laptop. We're sort of just like flooded with technology, but there are so many communities around the world where that is not the case. Even very basic technology, they do not have access to. And designing for a family living in a very remote village in India or Kenya is very, very different from designing for, a typical suburban American middle-class family, right? And so we need people who are creative and technically savvy and know circuits and know coding, but also have a sense of empathy, right? Because if I think this is where a lot of international development efforts have gotten in trouble in the past is, somebody somewhere, usually in North America or Europe, comes up with this great idea that they think is going to really benefit communities, but they don't actually ever talk to anybody in the communities that they're wanting to impact. And so they are just making all kinds of assumptions about what people actually need, what they actually want, what they can afford, what makes sense for their way of life. And so we need empathic engineers and empathic inventors who will take the time to really understand the people that they are wanting to serve, and then design something really amazing, out of that. So one example I cite in the book is this woman named Megan Mukuria. So she is an American, but she now lives in Kenya, and I believe she's married to a Kenyan man, and she's been in Kenya for quite a number of years now. So she has developed, she has a company that has developed sanitary pads for girls. And it all came out of this desire to actually help girls stay in school, right? Because so many girls were missing, significant periods of time of school because of their menstrual cycle, because then they would have to stay home. They couldn't, and eventually they would drop out. And it led to all of these negative outcomes. And I think it is only because somebody like Megan and her team took the time to be in the community, to talk with these young girls and their parents and their teachers, to understand that girls attending school is not just about needing more schools or needing more books or needing better teachers or maybe, reducing misogyny in the community. I mean, those are certainly all things to look at, but this was a key component of the equation of why so many girls were missing school and having to drop out of school. And it could be addressed by technology. And so then they developed a particular sanitary pad that was very affordable, that came in small packs so that you don't have to buy, 50 or 100 like we do here, because that actually really adds up. And that's really expensive for families that only make a couple dollars a day. And that enabled then girls to be able to stay in school. And so we need these kinds of creative, innovative solutions, and we need these sort of engineering minds to be able to do that, because it can have a profound impact on the lives of hundreds of millions of people around the world.
I'm curious about whether, first, yes, and design is so important, and disability and accessibility is something that I feel very passionate about. And I think one of the ways that we help people integrate into living their, having access to living full lives is through design. And generally speaking, everyone will benefit from that. And I think a lot of what you're talking about here is when we contribute to a cause that we believe in a way that we are able to sustainably and consistently contribute, it not only helps us, and it not only helps see progress with the cause, but it actually can then, spread through communities in a way that, those girls who have gone to school are going to change, the butterfly effect. They're going to change their communities. They're going to achieve things that they never have.
Absolutely.
And so when we start with practical ways to contribute, is like, there's so much worth there. But I'm going to ask though, when what I asked before about how we rethink the word sensitive, but how do we rethink being a person who really wants to contribute and yet can't give what they want to give, can't give them their whole selves, and they end up feeling a sense of shame or a sense of failure about not being able to meet the moment or attend the protest, or, how do you address that in the book when it comes to the way that we take on, when we are these people, we have a tendency to take on responsibility for a lot, but we're also taking on responsibility for somehow not being who we thought we should be able to be. And at one point, I think you say something to the effect of, if everyone else can do it, why can't I?
Yeah. Well, I think that is a really important first place to start, is to take the time to really understand who you are and what are the particular gifts and talents and limitations. It all comes in one package for all of us, that we each bring. Because you are you, and there is nobody else like you, right? So I think that is part of it. And so I do spend a few chapters talking about this ideal that we all have in our heads, and it may look a little bit different for each of us, but I think a lot of us do have the sense of, this is who I should be, this is who I should aspire to be, and so my hope is really that we will be able to not aspire for something that we will never be, but just aspire to be a fuller version of who we already are, right? A fuller, healthier version of who we already are. And that requires some stretching. I don't mean to say, only do what feels completely comfortable to you, because most of us sensitive people will probably just end up staying home, sitting on our couch and reading a book or something.
Writing one.
It is a really healthy thing to stretch ourselves, to do things that feel a little bit uncomfortable, to kind of see what our limits are. I think that's kind of how we learn what is okay and what is not okay for us. But yeah, this as I've been looking through, so I went to my local library and I looked at every single book that they had on, social justice movements and biographies of people who had engaged in social activism, looking for examples of, okay, I know not everybody is Martin Luther King. Like, I need to find other people. And what I found is that, well, for one thing, there are so many who have engaged in social justice in some ways, I guess, maybe everyday ways. I don't want to call them small ways, but everyday kind of actions that are actually really significant and really meaningful. There are also a lot of people who I somehow, at least for me, I had this picture of the activist who is like the 24/7, 365 days a year activist. There are a lot of activists who throughout history who kind of go in and out of working toward a cause, So Dorothea Dix is a great example. She was one of the earliest advocates in the US for more humane treatment of people who struggled with mental illness, right? And she herself struggled with chronic illness. And so she would spend a few years doing advocacy work, and then she would go on vacation in Europe for a few years to rest up because she wasn't feeling well, and then she'd come back and then she'd go again. Or, Gandhi would take like weeks at a time, just, meditating, meeting with pilgrims, not marching, not fasting, not doing all the things that, right? It's like he needed all of those times and some extended times of respite to prepare him, I think, to kind of store up the energy and the courage and everything that he needed for those more significant social actions that he engaged in. And I think there is just the reality of life. If you have young kids, if you have an aging parent, if you have a chronic illness, if you just need to work to pay the bills, right? There can be all kinds of things going on that you just don't have the margin to go be, super active in causes that you care about. And that is okay. I think all of the grace and understanding for you, because we all need to live our lives. And it is really important for you to care for yourself, to care for the people around you. That is a very, very good reason to put your energy toward kind of a smaller circle, as opposed to thinking about what's going on in the broader world. But also, in my book, I talk about these everyday things and how they can have an impact. And one of my favorite statistics that I came across was that Adam Grant, the organizational psychologist, looked at over 500 different studies and found that one of the most effective ways to influence other people is simply to have a face-to-face conversation with somebody, somebody from a different background, and somebody you might not normally connect with. And these are not conversations about debating them or trying to convince them to be on your side or trying to change their mind. These are just conversations about getting to know one another. And through all of these conversations that were happening, one-on-one, face-to-face conversations, 94% of the time, there is a reduction in prejudice and bias. And so it is incredibly effective just to be kind, to engage with your neighbors and the people around you in humanizing, caring ways. And so I think that we can all do our small part, even when we are in a time of life that is really full.
Right. There's so many things. One of them being that, I think our world makes it harder to connect. It being intentional in connection in having these conversations is so critical, and sometimes means that we have to make the effort. And I'm wondering if this may be too deep of a question that would lead us on a journey, but is there also work within the social justice community that needs to be done to better accept the different ways that people can make change, the quiet ways that they can make change? It's not just about us knowing ourselves, but it's also the community knowing how to value people who are contributing in quieter ways.
Yes, I think very much so, because this ideal activist that I've been talking about, it is not something that I made up. There is research being done in social movements now, and social scientists are finding this very consistent culture within activist circles and organizations of self-sacrifice, of martyrdom, of impossibly high standards and expectations. And this, I think you mentioned the word judgment. There is this sense of judgment of, oh, you're doing the wrong kind of activism. That doesn't really count. Or your background, that doesn't qualify you to be able to speak on this topic. And there was one really striking study where I think about 2/3 of activists who worked for an organization said that they had never had a single conversation with their supervisor about self-care. The word, it's like you can't even mention it, and people who do tend to be mocked and derided because that doesn't fit. What fits is you give your all 100%, all the time, no exceptions. And if ever you want to take a break, go on vacation, have a weekend, it is seen as weakness. It is seen as a lack of commitment to the cause. And I think that those are incredibly harmful cultural components that we are seeing within activism today that are hurting everybody, regardless of whether you're sensitive or not. I think for sensitive folks, it probably hits a little bit harder because we may have more significant needs in the area of needing time away, needing quiet, needing other outlets. And so, yeah, I think it starts a lot with the leaders, with those who are shaping organizational policies like HR folks, those who are developing cultures within organizations and groups of how do we intentionally build into the way that we work, this kind of rhythm of regular care and rest. So I work now for a small nonprofit, and when I first joined, they spent almost an entire meeting, like an hour a week. And we're a fully remote team. And so, coming together is actually quite rare, and it's not easy to get everyone together, even in the same Zoom room. And so they would spend an hour a week on, what we called a contemplative practice of meditation, of sharing, of, prayer for one another. And at first, honestly, like even for me, I was like, this is not a good use of our time, guys. Like there is so much more we could be doing. Yeah. It was really uncomfortable for the first at least 6 months. And I would be a little bit grumpy showing up to those meetings. And then now a couple of years in, I realized, oh my gosh, like that, there is so much that comes out of those meetings. So it's not your typical output. It's not something you can put on a spreadsheet. It's not a dozen emails, but there is this very rich sense of just deep connection that we have with one another. This sense of like, we have each other's backs, that you as a person are so valued and so appreciated just because you're here, not because of anything you did. And so that sense, like it carries over into the work that we do. It sort of gives us extra life and energy. And I think this like generosity of heart that we can share with everybody that we interact with. And so it is very much, I think, a worthwhile endeavor to try to institute some of those, and I think in the beginning, it's probably going to need to be a little bit more structured, a little bit more scheduled, and it's going to feel really weird. And people are going to be super uncomfortable. But it is one of those things that over time, the returns that you see, they're invaluable. You can't measure them.
Thank you for that. That's a wonderful way to end our conversation. We have concluded our hour together. And I have not concluded my list of questions and things that we could talk about. So I encourage everybody who has been part of this conversation, listening in to this wonderful conversation, to pick up a copy. Click on that link that you're being provided in order to get a copy of Dorcas's book. And I would love to just close with something you share at the very end of your book. You write, quote, "Hope is a choice. It is a verb, an action we pursue," unquote. And with this book, you encourage all of us to choose hope and to continue experiencing that hope through taking the right actions that can sustain us as well as the things that we believe in. And I think it's just such a gift from you to us, to the people that everyone who reads it will continue to help. So thank you. Thank you for this hour. And have a blast with your new book coming out. And I hope everybody reads it.